Hello, New Prospect. Welcome to RTB 2021 for December the 4th, 2021. Hope you're doing well today. So our text for today, jumping right on in, we have 2nd Chronicles 3 and 4. We have Nahum chapter 2, Luke 18, and finally we have 1 John 3. So why don't we jump in right in with Luke 18, text we've been at before, but let's comment on it again. The text begins, remember this is Jesus still on his way to Jerusalem, and so we have some of these final teachings of Jesus as he approaches the culmination of his ministry here on earth with his death, burial, and resurrection. These parables that he teaches here are some of the more well-known parables that we have in the Bible. We have the parable at the beginning here of the unrighteous judge, this one who does not respect man or fear God, and yet in response to this widow who continues to bother him, he will still respond to her. And the argument Jesus makes here is the argument that we sometimes we will see Jesus making. It's a kind of a rhetorical device known as the lesser to greater argument. So if this lesser person does this, how much greater will God do this? And in this case, God, he's not saying that God is unrighteous, but he's saying that if an unrighteous judge will respond, how much more will a righteous, ultimately infinitely righteous God respond? Then you have maybe my favorite parable of Jesus is the parable of the Pharisee and the publican, the tax collector, who is compared to the Pharisee. The Pharisee, and the comparison is how they are dealing with their own inner sin and in prayer to God and how they are worshiping. And of course, the Pharisee is standing, and I love the phrase that Jesus uses here. The Pharisee stood and was praying to himself, not to God, to himself. He says, God, I thank you that I'm not like these other people, the swindlers, the unjust adulterers, even like this tax collector. So here's this one who, in his pride, is not recognizing his own fallenness and his own desperate need for salvation. But then we have this tax collector who's beating his breast and saying that God, asking God to be merciful to him. And notice the phrase there, the sinner. It's almost like Paul, right, talking about himself as the chief of sinners. Here's this tax collector recognizing the just how deep his sinful nature is, and of course that recognition is always what is necessary. Ultimately, the first step in salvation, right, is seeing our inability and our sinfulness compared to God's righteousness, and then crying out to God for that mercy that He abundantly gives. So I love this parable. Then, of course, we have Jesus's encounter with the rich young ruler who struggles with coveting. Notice that we've talked about this before, but in verse 20, Jesus goes through all the commandments, but he doesn't mention thou shalt not covet. There's a reason. It's almost like he's ironically targeting that. That's the one he struggles with. And it goes away because he was extremely rich and didn't want to give up any of that. The disciples are amazed with this, say, who can be saved? And then we've had that famous statement, things that are impossible with people are possible for God. And this, of course, is speaking specifically about salvation in that context. And then we have another great story, the story of blind Bartimaeus receiving his sight here at the end of this chapter, which is a wonderful story. Really, one of the first people in the Gospels to see Jesus rightly. Even though he's blind, he still sees Jesus rightly as identifying him as the Son of David, full of mercy upon his people, seeing him as that true messianic king. And Jesus doesn't silence him in this case, and rewards his faith by giving him sight. So that's Luke. Let's move over to 1 John 3. So in 1 John 3, we have some of the main themes of 1 John coming out. And remember that 1 John is a book about assurance of salvation and exhortations against false teachers, but also exhortations one of the main themes is the exhortation to love. And we'll see that as a big theme. We saw this, of course, in the Gospel of John as well, but the theme of love is central here in 1 John 3. And of course, that love is modeled most of all by the great love of the Father in verse 1 that he has bestowed upon us. And how is that love demonstrated? That we are called children of God. And I don't think I didn't preach on this text, but this is one of those texts where it speaks about the adoption image of our salvation, that we are brought into we are not natural children of God. We are brought in, adopted in through the work of Jesus Christ into the family of God. And as children of God, we are looking forward to what we will one day be. We will be like him, verse 2, one of the great promises of Scripture, because we will see him just as he is. And that's our hope. That's what we fix our hope on. He says in verse 3, and as we fix our hope on him, if we have our eyes on that and not on the things around us, the world that can so easily ensnare us, we will purify ourselves, not through our own work, but through the work of Christ, as we fix our eyes and gaze upon that which we are being made into, images of Christ. Then he has some exhortations against sin and lawlessness. So in verse 4, everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness. Sin is lawlessness. He also appeared in order to take away sins. That's interesting, right? And in order that in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. Now, does that mean that we're ceased from sin? No, that's not what he's saying, because of course at the very beginning of 1 John, he says that if anyone says they have no sin, he's a liar and the truth's not in him. So what is he talking about here? He's talking about this continual sin nature. So if you are continually in a sinful state and are continually rebelling against God, that's problematic, and it says something, I think, about our hearts. Let's see what else we can say about this. And then at the end, of course, he talks about the nature of our love towards the brothers, and that's a defining characteristic of believers in covenant relationship. Yes, we love God with all our hearts, but we also love our those who are also in the covenant community of faith, and that is how we are known. Just as Israel was to be known through their love, through their commitment and covenant. Remember that love here is covenantal commitment. So also we are to be known by our love. And and that love, notice, is not just something that's an emotion, but it's in deed and in truth. Verse 18. That's how we love. So much more we can say about that, but just meditate as you go through this chapter about the nature of the love that God has called us to. All right, let's move over to 2 Chronicles, and this is in 3 and 4. So here the author of Chronicles is taking a lot of the material that we find in 2 Kings, and actually what's interesting, 1 Kings, and actually what's happening here is there's some, it's virtually the same in many places, but actually the author of Kings the author of Chronicles kind of shortens it, makes it more concise, which is kind of surprising that he would do that, given that he has such an interest in the temple and its place in the faith of Israel. But it is shortened from the 1 Kings version. But also what's interesting again is what is left out of this text, and we have some of the episodes from Chronicles that are left out. Let me give you some of the specifics of that. Let's see. Hold on. So the main focus here is on I think the reason why it's shorter is that the main focus is on proper worship of Yahweh that occurs at the temple. The building is only important as important as it leads you to proper worship, and that's a big theme of the author of Chronicles here in this text. But of course, The larger issue is showing Solomon to do all this by the book, right? He's showing Solomon to be this ideal figure. And this, of course, is leading forward to ultimately to an anticipation of an ideal king to come. So I think that's all I will say on that. Yeah, and then we'll talk more about the ark being brought into the temple and the glory of God filling the temple in this next chapter, starting tomorrow. So let's move finally over to Nahum, and this is Nahum 2. So remember that Nahum is a prophecy about the fall of Nineveh, and it's a prophecy of judgment against the Ninevites. And we talked about their brutality and that kind of thing. I think we're not getting to the most brutal judgment. So I'm going to save that discussion until tomorrow, because we get into chapter 3. There's some unsettling judgment that's talked about in chapter 3. But here we do have this prophecy of the overthrow of Nineveh. It's almost like the rhetorical devices here are very stark. You have, for instance, in chapter 2, verse 1, the one who scatters has come up against you, and then he starts barking out orders. Man the fortress, watch the road, strengthen your back, summon all your strength. But of course, this is not going to do any good, because the Lord has committed to restore the splendor of Jacob, and like the splendor of Israel, even the devastators have devastated them, and they destroyed their vine branches. And so we have because of what they have done, they will experience a devastating judgment. And this, of course, is pointing to God's justice. God is a God, as I talked about a few weeks ago in one of my sermons. God is a God who is all just. And just because he is slow to anger and abundant in loving kindness doesn't mean that he has this indifference or a lack of power. He will ultimately hold those to account who are affronting him and his will and his ways. So we'll talk more about that on as we get to tomorrow, and we get to some of these really devastating judgments that are talked about here. Nahum's not jubilant at the fall of the city, but he's expressing his confidence, I think. And that's the confidence we can have as well, that God will ultimately, bring forth justice. And that will ultimately happen completely when God finally judges everyone in that final judgment. So that's, I think, all our text for today. We got Chronicles, we got John, Nahum, and Luke. So I think we're all good on this day, December 4th, 2021. Hope you have a great rest of the day.